I'm Katie Lannon, in for Adam Riley. Tonight on Talking Politics, a look at the confirmation process for incoming Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court Justice Gabrielle Wolahogen, who was never pressed on how she'd handle cases involving her former partner, Governor Maura Healey. I'll talk to the head of the State Bar Association about the council that approved her. Plus, a look at the new GBH News podcast, What is Owed, and the century-long fight for reparations in Massachusetts and beyond. Host Soraya Wintersmith joins me ahead. But first, the Massachusetts Republican Party has changed a lot in the era of Donald Trump, embracing the former president and other GOP candidates much further to the right than the likes of Governor Charlie Baker and the old guard of Mass GOP moderates. But one candidate running for the Republican State Committee is beyond the pale, and the Mass GOP formally condemned Lori Kaufman for her reprehensible rhetoric, which includes homophobia, transphobia, and calls for the expulsion of Jewish people. Mass GOP Chair Amy Carnevale joins me now to discuss. Amy, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for having me, Katie.
I do want to talk to you about kind of the unusual step your party has taken here, both a few months ago in December, urging this candidate not to run for state committee, and then urging people not to vote for her. You said this is part of trying to create an inclusive political environment within the party. What does that look like to you?
So as soon as we learned about this candidate's background and her rhetoric, which, as you pointed out, is really beyond the pale, the party immediately took measures to condemn her remarks, and for the first time that I can remember, actually urged her to withdraw her candidacy. And that resolution passed at a vote of the Republican State Committee unanimously. Further, I have gone further to state that she's not welcome at any party events. We want to do everything we can to disassociate ourselves with this individual. We do not consider her a member of our party, in fact, and we hope that voters will not vote her into office.
So how do you build that kind of environment that's inclusive to different folks, bring more Republicans into the party? I know you've talked about being back in the fight, but also kind of draw a line against extremism and some things that just there's not a place for.
Yeah, so I think it's exactly what we did in December, and again, renewing that call again last week when more comments came to light that were repugnant and, again, beyond the pale for any candidate in Massachusetts. And it's just echoing that message that at the Republican Party of Massachusetts, it is a new day. We do welcome individuals of all backgrounds, and we're actively taking steps. We're working with one of our existing state committee members in Boston, who happens to be a Black woman, to reach out to the Black community in Boston. So we want to take steps to enlarge our reach and welcome all Massachusetts residents into the party.
And you have the legacy, it's the party of Charlie Baker, of Bill Weld, of Paul Cellucci, of Mitt Romney, but, it's an election year. There's that strong base of support for Donald Trump here and nationally. Who is a Massachusetts Republican in 2024? It's
a good question. Certainly Donald Trump is popular with the grassroots of the party. And looking ahead to Tuesday, I think he'll maintain strong support going into the primary election. That being said, when you think about elections here in the state, whether it be statewide or in local office, Republicans need to run under a banner and talk about messages that resonates with those voters, and often that's a candidate who may have a broader reach and may talk about different issues than we do at the national level. Yeah. And all of those, I would say, are welcome in the Republican Party in Massachusetts.
I think it's been, acknowledged that it tends to be harder for Republicans running in the state level offices here when it is a presidential election year. I know that since the 2016 election, the Republicans have lost seats in the legislature kind of each election. What are you looking to do within the state, I guess, after Tuesday?
Yeah, so after Tuesday, and really leading up to Tuesday, we have an ongoing effort to try to recruit candidates who have either been elected to municipal office to think about maybe stepping up and running for something bigger, or candidates who are well known in their communities to think about running for office. Massachusetts voters have shown that they can split the tickets. It is harder in an election year, in a presidential election year, but we know it can be done. And looking back, you mentioned 2016. Looking back to 2016, we did actually gain 1 seat in 2016, so it can be done. And looking ahead, we certainly know of opportunities, many in Plymouth County that we're targeting, where we've had Democrats who have been serving in office are no longer running for re-election, and that tends to be the type of opportunity that favors a Republican coming into office.
It does look like there'll be several instances in the state legislature where the incumbent Democrats are not seeking re-election this year, so a lot of open seats. But, one of the things that's interesting about the electoral dynamics in Massachusetts is so many voters are unenrolled or not members of a political party. I think it's the latest figures this week have that around 63%. Mm-hmm. We have a little over 8% for Republicans, around 27% for Democrats. How are you thinking about the voters who are not registered Republicans but might pull a Republican ballot on Tuesday in the primary to make a choice there, whether it's for Donald Trump or for Nikki Haley? Are you doing anything to kind of bring those voters into the fold?
Yeah, good question. So certainly we're well aware that the number of unenrolled voters in Massachusetts outnumbers both Republicans and Democrats. So that's really our target audience. We can typically count on Republicans to vote for Republican candidates, but we really want to target those unenrolled voters who may in some elections vote Republican, may in some elections vote Democratic. So those are frankly our target voters. And it's talking about some of the messages that really resonate with those voters, like affordability in Massachusetts, the migrant crisis, which is an ever-ballooning burden on Massachusetts taxpayers with no end in sight, and putting a strain on local municipal budgets. So it's kind of talking about those issues that appeal to those voters in the middle and those unenrolled voters in Massachusetts.
If we head, as it seems we will, to another Trump-Biden rematch, how do you get those pocketbook issues? How do you reach those moderate voters when we have a 2020 rematch, another divisive national election?
Well, I've said since I was elected chair a little over a year ago that I'm going to focus on issues of concern here in Massachusetts. There's not a lot we can do at the state party level to really affect the national dialogue and national issues, other than perhaps the border. And so the border, we are seeing more and more because of the Massachusetts policy that really encourages those migrants to come in to our state. That does have a real impact. So we'll continue. And I do think that, again, it's a message that residents are really well aware of. So that's something that we'll continue to talk about. But in terms of the presidential election per se, that's going to play itself out on the national level. And my focus will be here on the state level.
What's the mood heading into Tuesday as we've got the Trump-Haley primary with all the dropped out candidates who are still on the ballot, and
right,
all your state committee, 80 seats, I think,
80
up on
seats,
the ballot?
Yes. Yeah, so headed into Tuesday, there's a lot of excitement on the Republican side. We have Nikki Haley coming in this weekend for Donald Trump. There's lots of rallies and standouts that'll be happening over the weekend and into Tuesday. And I believe both campaigns, I know the Trump campaign is planning a party on Tuesday night. So there's a lot of excitement and activity going into Tuesday to try to compete not only for Republican votes, but those 63% that we mentioned, the independent voters, and try to get them to cast a Republican ballot. And we are hearing from the Secretary of State's office that the number of absentee ballots or the mail-in ballots requested on the Republican side has exceeded those in past elections. So my guess is we'll see increased activity and increased number of votes on the Republican side, which is a great thing.
Oh, well, that'll be interesting to watch for as we see how it all turns out. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Amy Carnevale, chair of the Massachusetts Republican Party.
Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. Judge Gabrielle Wolohojian will be the newest justice on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court after winning overwhelming support from the Governor's Council, the elected body charged with vetting and confirming judicial nominees. But her confirmation wasn't without controversy because during her hearing, the council failed to press Wolohojian on a key ethics question she'll face on the bench: how to handle cases involving her former longtime partner, Governor Maura Healey. Joining me to discuss are President of the Massachusetts Bar Association, Damian Turco, and Commonwealth Beacon reporter, Gin Dumchus. Thanks to you both for being here. Gin, I want to start with you because I know you covered the hearing and the vote on the newest SJC Justice, Judge Wolohojian. And during that hearing, one of the counselors referred to her past romantic relationship with the governor as the elephant in the room. Was that the atmosphere? How did it go when this question came up?
Sure. Well, she ended up being the lone vote and the one expressing discomfort with the situation. I think everybody agreed that Justice Wolohojian was incredibly well qualified for the role. I think there was a desire for more discussion, at least on the outside, more than the inside, about the context of it. I covered the first SJC nomination made by Governor Healey, and I covered the second one with Wolohojian. And it was very much a tale of two nomination hearings. The Governor's Council pressed Bessie DeWar about her lack of judicial experience. She hadn't been a judge before, which is not really new for the Supreme Judicial Court. Margaret Marshall, the Chief Justice, former Chief Justice, didn't have experience as a judge either, but they very much pressed her about that. And when it came to Wolohojian and stuff that people had been talking about, they largely shied away from it. So this was a Governor's Council that did not want to engage in, as one counselor out of 7 called it the elephant in the room.
And Damian, what do you think? Should this be part of the discussion? Is there a legitimate question around whether a high court judge, how she'd handle having had a past relationship with the governor, a past romantic relationship?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show, Katie. I mean, my feeling on this personally is that it might be. It's certainly fair game to put that issue out there, and any of the counselors could have done that. Counselor Jacobs did, speak a bit about this and about the issue of potential recusal. Didn't really come at it with a question, but the Justice Wolohojian did essentially answer the question not asked for the most part. And that's that, she has had a long history of being an appellate court judge. I mean, I think, at this point in the assessment process, we're not talking about someone with no experience as a judge. We're looking at a person that's probably the most qualified in the state. And it's not, unknown. It's very well known. We know the number of cases she's been before, 2,700. We know the number of opinions she's written, 900. We know that the number that she's been overturned on is remarkably low, 2 or 3, is what she testified to in the hearing. There's a mechanism for the judge's recusal, and that is Justice Wolohojian. She'll be able to recuse herself on her own regard, but there's also another process. A motion can be submitted. Judge Wolohojian would rule on that, but then there's a secondary step. The rest of the justices could then further review that recusal motion if it was denied. So there is history beyond just the procedure in place regarding potential recusal, and that's her own behavior, her own recusal of herself when she was an appellate court justice, when then Attorney General Healey or Assistant Attorney General Healey was prosecuting. There is a history of her recusing herself. That's an assessment, really, Katie, that needs to be made by the justice, because she's the one, more than anyone on the planet, that knows whether she can be unbiased and fair in exercising her judgment in the case.
And that's what she said, essentially, in the hearing, that she'd handle, cases as they come up on a case-by-case basis. I do want to roll a clip we have of one of the governor's counselors, Terrence Kennedy, talking about how he sees the role of the council and what their job here is in a confirmation.
Our role is a very narrow one. It's to determine if the person who is sitting there is qualified for the position. There's no question, and no question in my mind, this nominee is qualified for that job, period. I have never asked a nominee anything about their personal life, and I never will.
So, Damien, what do you think there? Are there situations where the council should be looking at a potential judge, not just what's on their resume, but what happens outside the courtroom?
Sure, potentially. I mean, the judge's ability to carry herself and act reasonably and her temperament generally, as well as potentially distractions from personal life, I think those are things that might be raised. It's fair game to raise them if the counselor feels that that's the appropriate step to take. Remember, the counselors are elected officials. There are 8 of them across the state, 8 positions. And so, there's a democratic process to ensure each of those counselors is the right fit for that particular district. And then that counselor has to exercise their best judgment. What question should I be asking here? That particular counselor explained his perspective, but other counselors might have come from a different point of view, or might have different thoughts on it. But all of that's fair game to put out there in the world. What's different, I think, about this nomination in regards to her personal life is that it was really out there because there's so much reaction in the community, right? As soon as this news was out there in the media, there was a lot of reaction from different outlets. And so the issue had already sort of been thought about probably to a fair extent by all those interested in this, including the media. I think it's fair generally to consider issues like that. But at the end of the day, isn't the judges or the governor's job and the council's job to find the candidate that is the most qualified, that's going to do the best for the state, and consider all these other ancillary factors as well, but to weight them accordingly.
Great, and this is an election year. All 8 of those council seats are going to be on the ballot. There are 7 members currently serving 1 vacancy. And when we in the media talk about the Governor's Council, we often call it an obscure state panel. Gin, why is this such an obscure body, given that we vote on them every 2 years and they meet pretty much weekly?
And they make $36,000 a year on top of that. It's an archaic holdover from colonial Massachusetts times. And if you kind of look back over the last really 100 years, the Governor's Council has had quite a bad reputation. There was back in the 60s, there were accusations of them basically selling their duties. I believe 4 out of the 8 were actually charged. Governor Michael Dukakis actually came in, with that reformer impulse, and he set up the current system we have now, generally speaking, of the Judicial Nominating Commission, basically having a separate set of advisors who vet these nominees, who then put them forward to the governor, lieutenant governor, and then that nominee goes to the Governor's Council. If you want to go back, a decade, one of the current council members, Marilyn Devaney, she was charged or accused of throwing a curling iron at someone. And then she subpoenaed a reporter as an act of intimidation during the as it played out in court. So if you look at the broad scope historically, both in over the last 100 years and even in more recent times, the Governor's Council has had quite a terrible reputation.
Well, long history there, and something to think about as we come up on election season. Gin Dumcius, Damien Turco, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
The city of Boston is weighing the notion of paying reparations to Black residents to atone for slavery and centuries of economic exclusion. But what would that look like? That's the question at the heart of GBH News' podcast, What is Owed? In it, host Soraya Wintersmith looks to the past for answers and to the trailblazers of the fight for reparations. Soraya joins me now. Soraya, it's so good to talk to you about this.
Good to talk to you too, Katie.
I've been really enjoying listening to your podcast, in part because it's so broad, right? It looks, you got local history. The most recent episode travels to Ghana for a really heavy and moving segment there. What made you want to zoom out beyond just the discussion of reparations here in Boston?
It's a great question. I think America is at a time where it's really polarized, tense, divided, however you want to characterize it. But it's in these moments of tension where we kind of examine ourselves individually and like as a nation to think about who we want to be, what kind of country we want to be. And in that process, over the last couple of years, we've seen social justice issues and the thought of equity kind of rise to mainstream. This issue is one of the things I'm thinking about the state of California, the state of New York, like recently putting together its commission in addition to cities like Asheville and St. Louis and all the other localities that are exploring the issue. It's just, you kind of have to go beyond Boston.
And where is the discussion in Boston at this point?
This is a matter of perspective. So to start with the facts of it, we have a reparations panel. It's been assembled for about a year now. And the city did recently tap the external historians that will sort of create the account of history that's going to inform whatever recommendations the panel ultimately makes. Those are facts.
Okay.
Now, depending on how fast you wanted to see this process move or the manner in which you wanted to see it move, you might have some criticisms about the way Boston is pursuing. One thing that we don't say in the podcast, but is true, if you look at Evanston, Illinois, or Amherst just down the road, both of those municipalities have completed their reparations processes, and they started with funding. In other words, the local government was like, we're going to set aside some money. We will figure out the particulars of distribution later.
All right.
In Boston, we didn't do that. And again, if you listen to the podcast, and I hope everybody does, you'll hear some pointed criticisms about the way Boston has pursued the process.
So there's, certainly plenty of thorny issues.
Opinions.
Always opinions here in Boston,
Always.
right? No shortage of that. And one of the things that I've really found interesting in the podcast is you really do a good job making the case that this is not a new discussion, right? It might have a new prominence, new dynamics now, but you look hundreds of years ago to the fight for reparations, looking at the story of Belinda Sutton, who petitioned for a pension from her enslaver's estate. We actually have a little bit here, we'll roll, of historian Kira Singleton of the Royal House and slave quarters talking about what that struggle shows about the fight for reparations.
What I think is so important to me about people like Belinda Sutton is that it also shows us that Black people have always been their own political agents. They have always had radical politics, and they have always understood that the freedom that can be extended to them doesn't really matter if it doesn't extend to all Black people.
So you look that far back, you look at more recent history in the 1980s. What kind of path has already been tread here in Massachusetts?
When we were talking earlier, like just as colleagues, I was saying to you that I'm hesitant to say a lot about what was surprising or interesting to me about doing this work. But I thought about it, and this might be the most fascinating part of the podcast, I think. Don't hold me to that until we're all done with production.
I'm sure there's lots of fascinating parts to come.
There are. But looking at this part, when we say that Massachusetts is critical to how the rest of the nation functions later on in our history, it is so true. With the case of Belinda Sutton, it is early evidence that Black people understood that their enslavement was wrong, that their enslavement was counter in all ways to the ideals of the newly forming nation. And they were very clear-eyed, like in the case of Belinda Sutton, and reading her petitions, very clear-eyed about why they deserve compensation and why they shouldn't be enslaved. And I think the same is true for looking into Bill Owens in the 1980s. In episode 2, we play some tape that didn't air when he was interviewed at GBH for Basic Black in like 2000 or 2001. And listening to the tape, you can hear he is very clear about the case and his perspective, and I think Black
actually
people
have a
been
piece
for
of
a
that
long time.
interview as well that we can play from Bill Owens himself.
My parents did not have slaves, they were enslaved. And in fact, I was denied my inheritance of them because they were not even paid for the work that they did. And that's why it is so important that I receive my inheritance more than anything else.
Very clear, super resolute.
Absolutely. So that's been part of the discussion of the local history, and where do you go from here? What else are we going to hear the podcast tackle?
Preview for next Thursday, and again, I hope everybody listens. The podcast travels to Austria next week to explore what it took for that national government to move its narrative about being a victim of National Socialism or Nazism into owning its own complicity and the reparations funds that come out of that discussion.
Yeah, and that's one of the questions I think you've been looking at is, or you pose early on, is are governments ready to face their culpability? Is there an answer to that? Are they
The short answer is just some are and some aren't. I think for episode 4, it is really, really interesting talking to the Secretary General of the National Fund about what it takes, and also talking to an economist who has written extensively about the history of this issue and has a proposal for how federal reparations would work. And we talked to him about what he thinks it would take to move the national government on this issue.
Okay, so lots still left to explore, even though you've gone pretty far.
That's right.
Well, I can't wait to hear next Thursday's episode and keep following the series. Soraya, thank you so much for giving us a little taste of what is owed.
Okay, happy to do it.
Thank you. The first 3 episodes of What is Owed are out now. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts, or you can scan the QR code on your screen. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week and let us know what you think. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. And sign up for our politics newsletter while you're at it. Thanks for watching. Good night.